Hello, everyone. We're back with episode 48. I can't believe we got this far, and we are happy to welcome Shalaleh Rismani here as a speaker today. Shalaleh is a postdoctoral researcher at McGill University, and she's here to talk about human oversight of AI systems. Very exciting topic, which Shalaleh literally wrote the whole paper on, and I look forward to talking about it and all stuff, all other stuff that we were discussing in our prep call. So, Shalaleh, welcome to AI in Real Life. The floor is yours. And before we switch to your slides, if you'd like to say a few words about your work just in general and how did you end up where you are today and talking about AI and human oversight and all the interesting stuff that you've been working on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Elena, for having me on the podcast. So I have a background in robotics, and I was trained as a robotics engineer and a biomedical engineer more than 10 years ago now. And as I was learning more about robots and how we're building more and more autonomous systems and how they're coming to our lives, I kept thinking about their social and ethical impacts quite a bit. I kept thinking, how are these going to impact our connections, how we do work, how we connect with people, how we create art. And those questions kept coming back to me, and that's what really motivated me over the past almost 10 years now to do various forms of research projects and activities looking at impact of to increased automation in our work and our lives. And coming from an engineering background, specifically coming from an engineering background that focuses heavily on safety critical systems. So systems where if they would fail, it would cause some form of a severe injury or death. The concept of oversight and control was quite critical in those settings. So we obviously are very careful about how we design our airplanes or our cars and making sure that people who are driving or the pilots are able to exercise their oversight and control effectively. So that know-how and that knowledge is very important in traditional safety engineering. And there's a very established field of research around that. And as I was looking at AI systems, and specifically more of these like emerging AI systems and how they're being folded into our lives and our work, I noticed that type of thinking wasn't necessarily is not or was not as prevalent necessarily. So and I was just interested to see how the concept of oversight and control shifts when we're dealing with systems that are not as deterministic and that are also integrated into our lives or our workflows in very sort of ad hoc and organic and sort of distributed ways. And so, that's sort of what excites me about the concept of oversight and control. I think there's a lot to study in this space. I'll share a bit about some of the projects or some of the thinking that I have today.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just share your slides. Hold on a second. Yeah. So your paper is called From Use to Oversight, How Mental Models Influence User Behavior and Output in AI Writing Assistants. And the key takeaway is a really, really interesting one. And we were discussing it during our prep call. And we'll talk about it in a second. So essentially boils down to understanding how human understanding of how AI systems work doesn't necessarily lead to better oversight.
Right.
Not exactly what we were hoping for. Can you elaborate on that, and how did you guys work on that? How did the research go, and were you surprised by the findings at the end of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can definitely tell you a little bit more about as I sort of go on in sort of in the presentation and share a little bit more about the details. But definitely, there was an element of surprise in what we ended up finding. I think one thing that is really important that I do want to say, but that when we are designing these controlled human subject experiments, we have to constrain the experiment in very specific ways in order to be able to collect data that makes sense and that in order to be able to make assertions from it. So within the study that we were doing, we were focusing on AI-based writing assistants, and we specifically tried to create a setting, an assistant that actually made grammatical mistakes. And the idea behind that is that we were trying to simulate a near incident scenario. So imagine a near incident scenario when you're driving would be, let's just say you're driving, there's a car in front of you, and you have your speed is a little bit high as a driver, and then the car in front of you changes lane, and then there's another car in front that is really slow. And so at this moment, if you don't slow down, then you might hit the car that is very slow, right? And so that is a near incident scenario where there's a potential of an accident and so on. And so we wanted to try to somehow simulate that in AI-based writing assistant. And the idea is that if in these near incident scenarios, there has been studies within semi-autonomous driving where if a driver knows how the semi-autonomous car works, if they have a better understanding of the system, they're able to control it better. And a better understanding does lead to better oversight. And so we're trying to see if a similar case would apply. And but then a near incident scenario is very different in writing than in driving. It's extremely unclear what that is. And so we were trying to create a task that, in this case, like writing a cover letter, that was relatively high stakes, that if somebody did something wrong, then, it has some consequences. And that we were trying to create, a scenario that is potentially problematic. And so within that context, right, we ended up finding that, a better understanding of these systems, and by better understanding, I mean we ended up showing the writers and our participants how the writing by system works behind the scenes versus just telling. So one of our groups only knew how to use the system, so they knew what buttons to press and and then the other group knew how the system worked behind the scenes, and they had more examples. And then what we end up seeing is that people who had a better understanding ended up finding the system easier to use, which signals that they trusted the system more. And then potentially we think that this might explain the fact that they actually ended up selecting more suggestions with grammatical errors. And so the better understanding led to this sense of comfort with the system and this sort of observation of over trust. Now, there could be, so I think there's many explanations to sort of why that this might be the case. But I think the one key takeaway for us was that we can't just assume that just because somebody has read something about how, Copilot works or Cloud works, or if they've read, if they've had like a 10-minute introduction to it, that does not mean that they're actually they're able to sort of understand how the system is making mistakes. And then we can make that assumption and that assertion. And that assumption is sometimes made by companies who are putting these systems out, in the sense that, like, if people just learn how to use it better, then they'd be able to use it more safely. But I don't think we need a lot more evidence to show the nuances there, because I think some of the evidence that we have already doesn't necessarily support that line of thinking. Yeah.
Understood. So pretty much what could be happening is I'm talking as of right now, companies who implement AI into their business operations or are thinking about it, most likely, uh, they kind of can get into this, can have this sort of full sense of security when it comes to AI models and AI tools in general, right? So, as a company, as a CEO, I'm going to be pretty comfortable and confident that I just rolled this new tool out and I taught my employees, just showed them, I don't know, 15 video tutorial how these tools work. That means they completely understand what you're working with, what they're working with, and therefore everything is good, right?
Right.
So as it might be a pretty dumb thing to do, in other words, because this research doesn't support that in any shape, way, or form.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, there's definitely, yeah, I think that's one thing for sure. And I think this is specifically also even like it's more concerning when it comes to users that are not as familiar with AI systems, so they have very low levels of AI literacy. So in this experiment that we were doing, we explicitly recruited individuals who have minimal experience with the use of AI-based writing assistants, and we were trying to see that this assertion, like, okay, if I just told somebody how this works a little bit more, will they suddenly be able to like now pick up what's going on? And I think, when it comes to expert users, I think we can, so by expert user, I mean people that are able to, they know how an AI technology works. They may be able to actually develop it. They have worked with these systems for extended period of time where they've developed very sophisticated mental models of what the systems are and how they come into their workflow. And I think in those scenarios, that's a very different case. And I think in those scenarios, we've seen there are studies that show how experts develop their own ways of steering these systems and develop their own work practices around sort of setting up their workflow to make sure that things work for them. But then that type of a know-how comes from a very extensive engagement with these types of models and a very like in-depth understanding of what they're about. But then when we have novice users and then we do this like boilerplate training and for how these system works, we can't, there's just not enough evidence to show that that is enough in order to be able to effectively oversee these systems. And so if this is especially concerning if we're dealing with use of these systems in more high stakes environments. So if you are, bringing AI systems within writing like policy documents or like summarizing key, like medical notes and so on and so forth. And if the user doesn't have enough expertise in the context and how this AI is doing that work, and it's just glancing over things, they're not necessarily going to, be able to spot these issues that could come from these systems. And so I think, I was, my initial hope was from this experiment is that we don't find this, that this was not the finding we found. But I think it's an important signal and sort of a way of studying these systems that we need to do more of, because this is like this initial signal is not great. So, and there's other studies that show similar trends. So I think we really need to spend more time if we think and if we think human oversight isn't necessary, like, and so the other direction to go with is sometimes there is this line of thinking within automation of work is that sometimes it's actually better to remove the human from that workflow completely. And just because because of automation bias, because people tend to lose attention, over time, if you want, there are certain workflows that it might be better if you can develop an automated system that can operate safely on its own. And then not require the human to continuously intervene, because that just puts too much of a cognitive load on the person. And so, there's a case for that, I think, when we're trying sometimes doing, but I do think that when it comes to AI systems with their current reliability and performance, that would be pretty tricky to do, and maybe not even a good idea. And that's not the only issue. That obviously it goes into conversations around like, do we even want agents and autonomous systems to completely replace certain types of tasks that humans used to do? How does that affect nature of work? How does that affect human dignity and and human sort of voice? So there's all of that. There's a lot there, but I think this and the EU AI Act, there is this need for human oversight within high risk settings of applications of AI, but like what that actually looks like is extremely unclear. And what types of oversight is effective, and then how can you actually show that somebody exercised oversight effectively or not, is also really tricky. Because unlike a car, when you're driving a car and it's very clear that, okay, if I press the brake, the car is going to stop, like that's the outcome. But if you prompt a model, or if you ask Cloud or your agent, you set it up, you're not always sure what the outcome is going to be. I mean, expert users that have developed sort of all these workflows and processes to make it better, like make the outcome better. But most of the time, especially for non-students, they don't know what the outcome is, even if they know how to like somehow use the system, right? So that makes it really difficult to then to do exercise oversight, because you're pressing a button, but you don't know what that button is going to do. It might get you to go this direction or that direction, and you just like, it's sort of walking in a bit of a with a blindfold on.
Yeah. It's good that you started talking about EU AI Act. Specifically, that's Article 14
Yes.
that requires human AI oversight while working with high-risk AI systems. Well, we're gonna definitely talk about that a little bit later on, because I wanted to ask you a few things on that as well. How this article clashes with just pretty much your research findings. But let's go back to your paper.
Right.
Would you mind just, if that's possible, or just in a very short kind of gist of it, just tell our viewers what's that about? The key takeaway we already know, but just an overview of the paper, if you can, so
Sure.
we can just based on that, we'll I'll have some random questions as always.
Sounds good. Like, would you like me to go ahead with the presentation at this moment?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, well, so I guess we've talked about some of the elements of the presentation, but maybe let me see how to. But so basically, maybe I'll start with this, because this poster that you see is from the 1914, and this poster was actually posted in factories, and the intended audience of these posters were workers. And this was at the time period where there was a lot of automation and technology that was coming into these factories to basically automate a lot of the workflows that workers had at the time. And what it says here is that if you put safety first, if you have the right level of education and then know how to use things safely, then you're going to reach happiness. But if you're indifferent and you're ignorant or you're careless, then you're definitely not reaching happiness, and it's not going to go well for you. And so the idea behind this is that this poster seems very nice and dandy at the beginning, but what it's actually doing is that it's putting the blame on the worker for not having the right education and knowledge and not putting safety first. And what it's also doing is that it's not recognizing all the systemic, organizational, and broader work practices that need to be taken account to ensure safety at the workplace and safety of use of technology. And there's this idea of like blaming the worker for all the accidents. And a lot of studies at the time, a lot of studies of worker safety and technology safety started showing that incidents and accidents don't happen because workers made mistake, but it was much more broader of like how that organization brought that technology and how that technology was designed, and and that those were the elements that actually led to the incidents rather than the workers' education and understanding. And so the idea is that, are we doing similar things when it comes to AI and robotics? And so here we're seeing these are news articles that show headlines that show where the blame is being put. For example, there was a Uber self-driving car crash a few years ago where the operator ended up being charged over the fatal crash, whereas the system actually had design issues. In this case, you have another headline of the computer got it wrong. And there was another headline of Anthropic's lawyers take blame for AI hallucination music publishers lawsuit. And so where are we, putting this blame on? And are the users the ones to blame? Or we really need to take a bit of a more holistic approach? And so, and I mean, in the law as well, right, in the Article 14, as you mentioned, we are relying on human oversight in AI regulation. But then what does that really mean? Oversight, human oversight, we can think about human oversight in the process of like data labeling and creating training data sets, where a lot of workers in poor conditions are tasked with labeling, training data sets, and making sure that the content in them is sort of appropriate to training safe models. And there is also in the back, like in the development process, developers create system prompts and various safety classifiers and various sort of designs to make sure that the ultimate system is created in a safe way. And so what I look at them is like, this is the developer sort of tweaking and bringing in different components to make an AI system work the way it is. And then, are we talking about oversight at more of that organizational level, where we have workers going, but then really the leadership is the one who is deciding how AI technology is going to be coming in to the workplace. So oversight can, a human oversight, there's many people that are involved in the AI development and deployment process. And when we think about human oversight, Article 14 often talks about the user of the system and their oversight. But then I think when it comes to AI systems, we might want to need to take a step back and look at human oversight a little bit more broadly. And we can learn a lot, as I mentioned, from safety engineering about appropriate oversight. We have a lot. This concept of oversight has been critical in establishing many different industries. Here you can see a very quick snapshot timeline of safety engineering practices and how they developed for commercial electricity, for medical devices, for aviation. And the example I like to give is that, the first commercial electrical system was created in 1882, but the use of personal protective equipment was required by law in 2000. So that's a quite a bit of a gap and a bit of, process to get these policies in place. And for AI, we don't really have, 100 years to do this. We got to do it like a much faster rate. But
I was going to say, I hope it's not going to
take 100 years. Yeah, exactly. So we need to, and we can learn from these disciplines, and we are already learning, right? So that's already happening. And so, we need to think about, when it comes to AI, we need to think about control across different system dynamics. So I always like to give this example of like a bike. Like, we need to tell people, how to ride a bike, what is, how to, what safety gears to wear when they're riding a bike. So this can look like, how do you set up your AI agents for yourself? How do you protect your data? How do you end up actually, what are good ways of having setting up workflows with various AI agents and assistants and so on and so forth? What does that look like for different types of jobs, or for different types of sort of creative or connection, social processes, right? And so then the other layer is like more institutional, like how do companies and organizations how much do they want to control who has access to what types of AI systems and where in an organization? And ultimately, at more of the broader ideological level as well, as countries, as countries and sort of as societies and communities, we need to think about what is the role of a human versus the role of a human, like in society, and what types of social relationships and work relationship and workplaces do we want to have. These are really important, and all of these decisions, all of these levels of sort of are being made, in various countries. Various leadership are already making these types of decisions, and which really affect how much ultimately how somebody lives their lives and how much control they have over, for example, their own data, or how they use the system, and so on and so forth. So it's important to take care of the control across various, what I call, system dynamics. And this is a perspective that comes from system safety, where the idea is that the control is the ability for the controller, so it could be a human controller or an automated controller, to intentionally influence, override, or intervene system behavior. So we can have that at the Congress and sort of legislature level, or we could have this at very much like a human operator using an AI assistant, a medical device setting, or so on, or within law, or so on and so forth. So there's many different layers. And a lot of my work, and I won't go too much of this detail here, but there is a connection between how well users understand the system, so users' mental model of a system, and ability to control. So in system safety, the assertion is that if a user has an inconsistent, inadequate, or incomplete mental model, or put it more simply, if a user just misunderstands or has a poor understanding of a system, then they will not be able to exert safe control or effective control. And so how does that work? What does that look like for AI system? What is an adequate mental model, right? And does this connection even stand for AI? Which is what we wanted to study, right, in this work. And so really we were trying to understand, how do different mental models that users have affect the way they exert control in the writing process, and then do different mental models affect writing output. So if a user understands the system better, can they create a better output? And ultimately, if a user understands the writing assistant better, will they have a better experience of writing? And as I mentioned, we injected our version of unsafe behavior to see if people exert their control. And what we did is we inserted grammatical and spelling errors in a subset of the suggestions that we gave in the writing assistant platform that we were using. So what were our two conditions? Was that, as I mentioned before, we had a structural condition. So this is the group that was exposed to an educational video that included examples of how the platform worked, and in addition to what the platform does. So the structural condition were exposed to a longer training video. They knew more about the system. They were given examples. And then the other condition we had is called a functional condition, and they just knew how to use the system, right? And we exposed the two groups to our educational video, and we then did a survey and a test from them, like an understanding test from them. And we saw that our intervention, that our educational intervention had an effect. So the individuals in a structural condition performed better in the tests that we gave them compared to the functional condition. So, we go ahead with the experiments. And what we end up doing is our experiments started with just brief introduction to study. We got the participants to familiarize themselves with the platform a little bit. Then we either exposed them to, as I mentioned, to the functional video or the structural video. They had a bit more time to familiarize themselves with the platform. Then they took the understanding survey for us to know whether they actually, and how much they understood from our educational intervention. And then they were given 20 minutes to write a cover letter. And they had to write a cover letter for themselves. They had to write a high quality cover letter. And then we wrapped up with a post-task survey and interview. So you can see a little bit of what the platform looks like. People could press tab, and every time they press tab, they could get 5 suggestions. And then they also could put in instructions in this instruction box. which basically the instructions allowed the users, the writers, to customize the suggestions that they would get. So, so if they wanted, let's just say, suggestions about a specific job posting, they could write that in the instruction box, and that would affect the suggestions that would come up the next time a tab is pressed. So we had 48 participants in total, 24 in each condition. We had a relatively consistent split between the sort of the gender and the age distribution across the two conditions. And basically what we found is that the structural participants found the co-author, which was the platform we were using, easier to use, but accepted and kept more erroneous suggestions. So what that means is that across the board, so across both conditions, participants accepted or requested suggestions at the same rate. So basically, they were using the system to the same level. But then the participants in the structural condition ended up accepting more erroneous suggestions from those 5 suggestions that they ended up getting. And what we also noticed is that they reported the system to be easier to use, which is a signal of trusting the system more. Another thing that we also found is that even though the structural condition group ended up accepting more erroneous suggestions, both groups thought that they have high levels of control and ownership. So regardless of how much they actually exercise effective control, they perceived themselves to be in control, right? So, and the reason that this happened was because this particular writing assistant that we were working with gave them a lot of different affordances for them to exert their control and so on and so. So, for example, they could choose when to ask for suggestions. The system didn't automatically pop up the suggestions for them. They always had the ability to go back and erase, so the suggestions were always short, and they didn't necessarily have to deal with a block of text. And they wanted to, they thought that the suggestions were relevant and that they were able to use the instruction box to customize their suggestions. So they had a lot of different affordances. So that was really interesting. And they didn't necessarily use their affordances to give a high quality letter ultimately for the structural condition, but then they perceived that they had that control and ownership. So our key takeaways was that a general how mental model, so a general structural mental model may not be sufficient and to really improve control or perceived control, but it can lead to perceived ease of use, and this can be possibly backfire, as we have discussed. And we need to basically further establish what counts as sufficient epistemic access and causal power to exercise control and safely use AI systems. And so what we mean in the future, we really need to do much more research into understanding what is the necessary mental model that people need to have in order to be able to control these systems safely, because this simple explanation and simple training for novice users does not seem to be going in the right direction for us. And so, yeah, thanks. I'll maybe leave it at that for now, and then I'm excited to hear any questions.
Yeah. Where to begin, right?
Yeah.
As everything with AI, we are only starting to see the tippity tip of the iceberg that is all the repercussions and all the downstream effects that we'll experience over the course of the future, I don't know, decade or so. But it's very important research and the work that you do, and I know a lot of people in the space are doing amazing research on how AI is affecting us as a society, as a species, which is really fascinating subject. And I would pretty much advise everyone to read as much of that research as you possibly can, because it's really something that will definitely change us forever. And, because obviously we can't just tell how much from
Absolutely.
here today. But yeah, fascinating stuff. What I wanted to quickly touch upon with you, you were kind enough to share this paper, um, design considerations for human oversight of AI, that touches upon pretty much what can be considered an effective oversight. Right, we've been talking about human oversight of AI systems. Um, so what that research shows, it's not enough only just to get the insight into the black box, how the AI system, how AI tool works and the reasoning behind it. And that these tools today, they're doing you can see the chain of reasoning, chain of thought, as
Mhm.
it's called, right? So what's kind of behind the scenes that can give you this false sense of, oh yeah, of course, I see that I can peek behind the curtain, so to speak. But what really got my interest is that that's not what's like that's not only that's necessary for the effective oversight. It's the contributing meaningfully for people. It's this sense of doing some meaningful work when it
Mhm.
comes to oversight, as well as collaborating with peers or colleagues on the use of AI tools, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just, to me, it really is fascinating how important it is, you know, while using those tools and just interacting with the tools, really to lean into your human side, to the human side of these interactions, and it's really interesting that the research highlights it as well. There's the motivation and
Mhm.
engagement, and sense of meaningfulness of
Mhm.
people who work in AI oversight, or people just overseeing, AI systems, and especially in high risk contexts, right? Because it's really important to ensure that this oversight really is working.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I don't know if you could just comment on this as well a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there is a couple of directions or thoughts that I have here based on what you just mentioned. And I think when it comes to the idea of oversight, generally oversight is more of established concept when we're thinking about safety or sort of positive or negative outcomes of the use of a system. And so so when we talk about so when some and there's different terminologies and sort of different within academic literature sort of different approaches to it. But when we say effective oversight or meaningful oversight, and the idea is that can a human um, be able to intervene in a way that actually makes a difference and make sure that there is no harm that is done. And I think when it comes to that paper that you were mentioning, it's that is really tricky to figure out when it comes to use of AI systems, of like an AI, and specifically like now we're moving towards AI agents as well, because now what tasks can you delegate to an AI system? How much, as an individual who has delegated that task, how much do you know about that task? Like how much of an expert are you in that task? And then how much uh, how well does an AI assistant or an AI agent perform that task? And all of those elements and other factors to affect like um, will affect how much meaningful or effective oversight somebody can have, right? And the idea is that when we want to exercise oversight on these systems, we shouldn't like the idea is that the humans shouldn't have to do everything from the get-go themselves in order to be
Yeah,
able to do it. That sort of ruins the whole point of like bringing these
yeah,
systems into your workflow. But then how much does the human need to know and how much do they need to be able to? So those are really, really tough questions, I think. And we're still, everybody, I think, is trying to figure that out at an individual level, but also at an organizational level. We do need to figure out what that looks like. And then I think there's this other element that you were mentioning, which I think is really interesting, because I think the way that sometimes humans are conceptualizing working with AI systems or AI assistants or agents is not necessarily an overseer relationship. It could be like a collaborative relationship, right? Where you're just, and I've been looking at some user data logs, like publicly available ones, where people will write, let's do this together, to an agent, like me and you are a team and we're working on something. And so there's this notion that, okay, I'm a collaborator, and sometimes with your collaborator you might not necessarily oversee everything they're doing. You're exchanging ideas, you're trying to learn from what they're doing, you're adding on. And this concept of oversight, which we currently have as part of the raw, sort of as part of the regulatory requirements for AI, shifts a bit, right? Like, and it's like, okay, is it collaboration? Is it exchange? Or is it oversight? Is it engagement? Like, where is this spectrum? Where are we on this spectrum?
Yeah.
And so I think, so if, even if we accept that humans in some contexts are overseers for AI systems, that itself is challenging to establish of how to do that. But I don't think we even agree on that, because I think I think a lot of people don't see themselves as overseers of AI systems. They're just, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a companion, maybe it's a collaborator,
Yeah.
and that really shifts things. So I think, it's really like, I think, there's a lot to sort of study there and discuss, and there.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. And as you were just talking, I was thinking like it's really tricky. And I think at the end of the day, it it will be up to a individual user to just be able to establish those lines. Where me as an overseer part ends and me as a collaborator part begins. Obviously it's going to depend on the seriousness of the task that I'm doing, right? If I'm asking Claude to do me just some basic research on the latest, I don't know, what's the latest news on this and this, for example, AI bill, right?
Mhm.
That just came out. Obviously I'm not going to just be in this overseer mode trying to stay on top of it, as Claude just scours the internet. But when I'm asking it to draft me as, I don't know, an agreement, a sample agreement or anything like that, that's kind of when you shift gears. And the same goes for if someone's asking for, I don't know, just personal relationship advice or anything like that.
Yeah.
It For us as humans, it's also really hard to switch to different modes, I guess, because again, as we already discussed earlier during our prep call, automation bias did not go anywhere.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we're just humans, and a lot of the times we as humans tend to just trust these AI systems
Yeah.
completely, or again, all the platitudes and the way they just interaction goes a lot of the times is just you get this false sense of, okay, I'm always right, I'm this awesome, I'm so smart, everything I'm saying makes sense, I'm making zero mistakes pretty much. So yeah, can get you it can get you in trouble, I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there is, I think there is in normal, like in human relationships, there's a lot of context and social norms and sort of that gives nuance of like what is how you oversee or manage or supervise within the context of a human relationship versus when you collaborate. And obviously, that shifts within the context of even one relationship, but we don't have the same norms necessarily, like that type of norms. AI assistant agent, people do develop, like, I mean, there's research that shows that, obviously people think that they're in a relationship and there's like a parasocial element sort of to it, but then it, like the way it is, it's extremely different than how it is with within a human relationship. And so in that sense, I love what you said in terms of how do you shift from the overseer to collaboration? How does that really affect, the outcome of everything, like outcome of the task that you're doing, your experience as like a person, right? Like those are, I feel like, we're gonna live and see how these things, and we are living and seeing how some of these are going. But I think at this point, I just hope that people are as reflexive and critical and or intentional about their practice at this, because that's
Yeah,
the thing we can really do. I feel like in more of an immediate sense, because everything else
yeah,
takes some time, right? Like studying it,
I
organizing
agree.
on board. Yeah,
I agree, absolutely. And also, I just quickly wanted to say, and then we were talking about Article 14, human oversight requirement of the AI Act. There's also Article 4,
yeah,
AI literacy, which was a requirement, which still is a legal obligation. We'll see how the omnibus trilogues go because the AI Act is in the process of being simplified. That's a whole different topic.
yeah,
On that note, I think you would agree with me because it cannot just all come crashing down on the users of the tools just to be educated, be AI literate. You need to be vigilant. You need to stay on top of it. You need human oversight. You need like the whole laundry list of things that you need to do. And for regulators to just, step in and think maybe there has to be some also responsibility when it comes to designing these AI systems and the interface and how the outputs work and all of that. And yeah, I think we all can agree that this should not be the user's burden to bear just to be this
yeah,
all-knowing, all-seeing person. Otherwise, you'll
yeah.
just be lost.
Absolutely. Yes, I absolutely agree. I think, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, I think a lot of the times, I think a lot of people are feeling that burden. But I do think that organizations who are bringing in AI and also organizations who are developing AI, they really need to do some like as much due diligence as they can to put out systems that are of quality, and also to make sure that when they're expecting their employees or to like use these systems, that there's an inherent risk and responsibility that comes with that, that is not on the employee or the worker or the user, that is on the organization. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. And it shouldn't be. And on that optimistic note,
Yes.
I would say, yeah, we will have to wrap it up. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
I really enjoyed it. And the slides just are beautiful, especially the medieval topic, which is just speaks to my heart.
Yes,
If anyone never saw my posts, sometimes I tend to go medieval.
yes, yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much. I'll make sure I'll post a link to your paper as well as a few other links to resources that you were kind enough to share with me today. And for everyone, we'll be back later, maybe next month or I don't know, during summer. Things are hectic these days. And to you, Shalaleh, thank you so much for joining us today. And it was a really, really fun but very important conversation that we need to have.
Thank you so much. It was my
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.